Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1986 psychological horror thriller, The Hitcher. Now, The Hitcher was directed by Robert Harmon, who prior to this did a short film called China Lake, which is actually included as a bonus feature on this Blu-ray for The Hitcher. But this was Harmon's first feature, and he would go on to direct movies like Nowhere to Run, the 2002 horror film They, Highwaymen, and he directed several of the Jesse Stone made-for-TV movies with Tom Selleck, based on the Robert Parker novels. The movie was also written by Eric Red, who would go on to write movies like Near Dark, Blue Steel, Body Parts, Bad Moon. He would also go on to be an author, publishing several novels. Now, Eric Red apparently partially based the movie off of a real incident where he picked up a hitchhiker and nothing bad happened per se, but he said he had a very unsettling feeling from this guy. The movie was also partially inspired by the Doors song Riders on the Storm, which is a song about a hitchhiking serial killer. The song itself was also partially inspired by real-life spree murderer Billy Cook, whose crimes were also the basis for the 1953 thriller The Hitchhiker, which might have also served as an inspiration for this movie. The movie could also be read as sort of a take on the old urban legend of the vanishing hitchhiker, or the phantom hitchhiker. Even though this isn't literally a ghost movie, there is a weird, ethereal, almost spectral quality to the main villain, but I'll get into more of the different interpretations you could have of this story in a little bit. But in a way, it is almost like a metaphorical adaptation of that urban legend. The movie is also said to be partially inspired by Steven Spielberg's first movie, Duel, which is a 1971 thriller based on a Richard Matheson story about a traveling salesman who, after a road rage incident, is being pursued by this psychotic truck driver. It's a great movie, and even if The Hitcher wasn't directly inspired by Duel, there are a lot of similarities between the two movies. Now, I have two copies of the movie. I have this older DVD of the film, and then I have this absolutely beautiful Blu-ray set that I think was released last year. Later on in this video, I'll show off this Blu-ray set a little bit more and go into some of the special features that's on this. But The Hitcher is one of my favorite films. It's one of the best thrillers of the 1980s, I think, and it's a film that's almost unclassifiable, because I do consider it a horror film, but it's also very much a psychological thriller. It's kind of a crime drama. It's kind of an action movie as well, and it's also kind of a modern-day Western in a way, or at least it definitely owes a lot to the Western genre. So the plot of The Hitcher is we follow a young man named Jim Holtze who is driving to California to deliver a drive-away vehicle, but as he's driving through the state of Texas, there's a huge storm, and he's starting to doze off at the wheel, and all of a sudden he sees a hitchhiker on the side of the road, and he figures, okay, this guy probably needs help if he's out there in the rain, and also talking to him might help me stay awake. So he picks the hitchhiker up, who introduces himself as John Ryder, and Jim immediately comes to regret this decision, because it turns out this guy is a psychotic serial killer who tries to kill Jim, but Jim manages to get the better of him and pushes him out of his car, and then he triumphantly drives away. Thinking the worst is over, he starts seeing Ryder everywhere he goes. It becomes increasingly apparent that Ryder has no interest in killing Jim, rather he wants to make Jim's life a living hell. And everyone that he crosses paths with ends up getting brutally murdered by the Hitcher, but the Hitcher pins the crimes on Jim. So now Jim is the prime suspect in this killing spree, so he's now on the run, not just from a serial killer, but from the police as well. well, so it becomes a fight not just for his life, but to prove his innocence. And in order to survive his confrontation with the Hitcher, Jim might be forced to give in to his own violent nature, which might be exactly what Ryder wants. So the film stars C. Thomas Howell, who most people might recognize as Ponyboy from The Outsiders, as Jim Halsey. And we see this character go through some major changes throughout the course of the story, where he starts off the movie as this shy, sweet, kind of naive kid. Now, I don't know how old C. Thomas Howell was when they shot this, but I believe the character of Jim Halsey is supposed to be like 17 or 18, like he's barely even an adult. But the film ends up being kind of a fucked up coming-of-age story where we see this boy basically forced to become a man. And Ryder, in a lot of ways, is his ultimate test of adulthood, is his ultimate test of manhood and masculinity. But you feel so bad for him throughout the course of this movie. Like, this kid is put through the ringer, and at one point he even attempts suicide, but then decides not to do it, and decides, you know what, I'm gonna face this guy. And then you have Rutger Hauer as John Ryder, the main villain of the film. Now, most people would probably recognize Hauer as Roy Batty from Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, but honestly, this is the movie I tend to think about when I think of Rutger Hauer. This is definitely my favorite performance from him. And his portrayal of Ryder is so understated, yet he plays the role with a kind of sadistic glee. And there's also a kind of homoerotic element to his performance, which I'll get into that more when I really dive into some of the themes of the film. But it's an amazing performance. John Ryder is one of the best movie villains, I think. And what really makes this character work as a villain is we don't know shit about him, and we don't need to know shit about him. We don't even know if John Ryder is his real name. We don't know his backstory. We don't know why he's doing this. We don't know why he's specifically targeting Jim. Now, while the film on the surface appears to be a reality-based thriller, there's a strange kind of dreamlike and ethereal quality to Ryder, and it should be noted that Rutger Hauer has said that he basically wanted to play Ryder as a phantom or a ghost. Now, he's not literally a ghost in the movie. Or is he? Because there are moments where he appears places where logically he should not have been able to appear, and there are things he does in this movie where it's like, okay, logically he shouldn't have been able to do all that, and you could say that's a plot hole in the movie, but it also feels very deliberate, as if there is something kind of supernatural or otherworldly to John Ryder. Now again, this is all open to interpretation. The film never outright says that Ryder is literally some kind of a phantom, and there is kind of a strange elemental quality to Ryder, where when we first see him, he's literally coming out of a storm, as if the storm itself birthed him. And then when he shows up the gym again, there's a huge sandstorm happening. And the final battle with him takes place in this open desert. There's this real sense that he is almost like the human embodiment of the desert itself. Again, there's a real elemental aspect to this character. Now, other actors who were considered for this role were people like Terrence Stamp, Sam Elliott, Michael Ironside. Apparently, Lance Henriksen actually read for them, and dear God, I could totally see Lance Henriksen play in this role. But I am glad that we got Rutger Hauer, because this is one of Hauer's best performances. The film also stars Jennifer Jason Leigh as Nash, a girl that Jim meets who unwittingly gets caught up in Jim's conflict with Ryder. And believing that Jim is an innocent victim in all this, she ends up helping Jim, but unfortunately this does not end well for her at all. And I really appreciated that they did not make Nash the typical love interest. In the original script, there is a scene where Nash and Jim have sex, but I think it was Jennifer Jason Leigh who said, yeah, that really doesn't feel right, and honestly, she's right, because realistically, these are just two total strangers who get caught up together in this horrific situation. The movie does tease possible feelings for each other, but it doesn't go that far with it. Like, it keeps it very grounded, I think, and makes it more believable. And Nash is honestly a great character, and I think that's owed more so to Jennifer Jason Leigh's performance rather than the script script itself, because Jennifer Jason Leigh is an amazing actress. Now, she does kind of become the damsel in distress by the end, and some people have actually accused the film of being misogynistic because of what ends up happening to her character. But one of the special features on the Blu-ray that I have of the film is an audio commentary from a feminist critic, and she argues that Nash is really the only voice of reason in the film, and she's the only woman in the film, and she ends up being the one real moral voice in the movie, because everything she ends up doing, even though it ends up getting her in trouble as well, is for the right reason. And while it is horrible what happens to her, I feel like thematically it makes sense if we look at Ryder as representing the worst or most toxic aspects of masculinity, or basically being the masculine id run amok. It makes sense that the one feminine voice in the film, who's really the one voice of reason, ends up being Ryder's ultimate victim in the movie. Because of all the people that Ryder ends up killing in the movie, she's the one person that we actually get to know and actually get to care about. So yes, that is a major spoiler that she ends up dying, and her death in the movie is one of the most horrific scenes in the whole film, and was even the source of some controversy, even though we don't actually see anything. It's just the implications of what happens to her is so genuinely horrific. We also have the criminally underrated Jeffrey DeMunn as Captain Estridge, one of the few good cops that we see in the film, because in the movie, the police essentially become sort of a secondary antagonist when they believe that Jim is the one committing these murders, especially when some cops get killed. Jim is basically labeled a cop killer, so you realize that these police are out for blood. Even when Jim tries to turn himself in, it becomes apparent that the police basically just want to kill him. And again, Captain Estridge is the one real good cop in the movie who is not necessarily on Jim's side in the beginning, but at least tries to treat Jim fairly. And Jeffrey DeMunn is just such a great actor. You might also recognize him from stuff like Christmas Evil, the 1988 remake of The Blob, where he actually plays a very similar character, as well as several of Frank Darabont's films like Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist, although most people would probably recognize him as Dale from The Walking Dead. I also got a chance to meet Jeffrey DeMunn at a Walking Dead convention back in 2016, which I can't fucking believe was over 9 years ago now. You also have Armin Shimerman, who most people might recognize as Quark from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, as a police interrogator who shows up briefly at the end of the film. Now, like I said before, there are so many different ways to interpret The Hitcher. You could just look at it as a standard action horror thriller about a hitchhiking serial killer, but I feel like there is so much more going on under the surface, especially with the whole relationship between Jim Halsey and John Ryder. Captain Estridge even says at the end, "There is something going on between you two, and I don't want to know what it is." Like, you get this real sense that Ryder is almost trying to initiate Jim, initiate him into his own twisted view of masculinity, this real violent form of masculinity. Like, in a way, Ryder almost is like a manifestation of masculine violence. It's almost as if there's this violent nature that all men have, and Ryder wants Jim to give into that. You also kind of get a sense in the movie that Ryder wants to die. He actually wants one of his victims to fight back and kill him, and it's almost like all of this, like this entire murder spree, was some weird, elaborate suicide attempt. Like, he wanted somebody to kill him, and he sort of chose Jim to be the one to do that. And like I said before, the movie never explains who John Ryder is or why he's doing this. One theory I have, and this isn't like my definitive theory for the film, I have different readings of the film depending on what my mood is, but one theory I have, especially with some of the things that we see Ryder do, is maybe he's somebody who has military training, like perhaps he's a traumatized Vietnam veteran who just went crazy. But again, it would not be as good of a movie if they outright explained that. Sometimes ambiguity can go a long way in the horror and thriller genres. Now, you could also read a possible father-son dynamic between Ryder and Jim. Not that John Ryder is literally Jim Halsey's father. I don't think he is. But in the movie, like in the beginning, when he first picks Ryder up, he says, "My mother told me never to do this," and we get kind of a sense that maybe Jim never actually knew his own father, or maybe his mother was really the dominant authority figure in his life, and in a very twisted, fucked up way, John Ryder becomes sort of again, a very dark and very fucked up father figure, but sort of a father figure in a way, because again, he is the one who kind of turns this boy into a man. But there's also kind of a homoerotic element to their relationship, because in the movie you also get kind of a sense that Ryder might literally be in love with Jim. There's also a moment towards the end of the film when John Ryder is in police custody. At this point, they know that Jim had nothing to do with these murders and that Ryder is the killer, and he's in police custody, and Estridge allows Jim to go talk to him in the interrogation room, and Jim, reaches for Ryder's hands, and then just spits in his face. And then, of course, they take Jim out of there, but you see Ryder kind of playing with the spit in a really, again, kind of erotic fashion. And if we go with these sort of homosexual undertones, you could almost say that his reason for killing Nash is he saw her as an obstacle that got in the way between him and Jim. Also, we can't forget in the beginning of the movie when Ryder is basically holding Jim hostage in his own car, they're going through, some road construction, and Ryder literally puts his hands right between Jim's legs with the switchblade, basically saying, "If you call out for help, I'm stabbing you in the junk." I mean, it ties into those themes of masculinity where you have Ryder literally threatening the most vulnerable part of a man's body. But again, it leads into some of that gay subtext. Now, what's funny is a lot of critics at the time read into the homoerotic undertones, but accused the film of being homophobic. Now, I don't personally think the film is intentionally being homophobic, but I understand this was the 80s where homophobia was running rampant, especially with the AIDS crisis going on, and maybe if you do interpret John Ryder as a gay character, maybe it isn't a good look to have a gay villain in a movie coming out in the 80s when, again, there was so much prejudice against the gay community at the time. But again, I don't think the film is intentionally. I do think there's definitely a homoerotic undertone to it, but again, I don't think the film is intentionally being homophobic. At least that's my opinion, but I recognize that that's easy for me to say as a straight guy. And it should be noted, some people have interpreted Jim as being gay as well. The fact that him and Nash never really do hook up in the film, and some people have interpreted their relationship as being more platonic. And some people have made the argument that the reason Ryder doesn't actually kill Jim in the beginning is he knows. And again, none of this is actually stated in the film itself. This is all just different people's interpretations, and I'm not saying it's necessarily my interpretation, but it is an interesting way to read the film. Also, like I said before, there are possible supernatural readings you could have of the film. The fact that Ryder seems to appear everywhere Jim goes, maybe he is some kind of a ghost. Or maybe he's somehow an aspect of Jim's psyche, which doesn't make a lot of sense considering other people encounter Ryder throughout the movie. Ryder is an actual physical being in the film, so we know he's not a part of Jim's imagination, but at the same time, there is this sense that Ryder is almost like Jim's dark reflection. Another theory I have on the film, and again, this is not my definitive interpretation, but another way you could possibly read it, now in the beginning, like I said, he's sort of dozing off at the wheel before he picks up the Hitcher, and there's actually a part where he almost gets into a car accident, and one way I kind of look at the film is, what if he actually died in the beginning? What if he actually did get into that car accident, and the whole film is taking place in sort of almost like a dream he's having in the final moments of his life. And if you read the film that way, then Ryder would literally be an aspect of Jim's psyche. And again, if we do want to go with the supernatural interpretation, but interpret the whole film as basically taking place during Jim's journey through the Valley of the Shadow of Death, perhaps Ryder is literally the angel of death, or maybe even the devil himself. And when he faces Ryder at the end, perhaps that's him trying to hold back death for as long as humanly possible. Now, there was a sequel to The Hitcher that does explain what happens to Halsey after the events of this movie, and would completely contradict any of these alternate theories we might have. But right now I'm just looking at The Hitcher as a purely standalone film and disregarding the sequel. And if we go with this interpretation that the film is taking place in Jim's afterlife, or is taking place in a dream he's having as he's dying, it's interesting. You have the scene where Ryder confronts Jim at the diner and he puts the coins over Jim's eyes, which is a tradition that dates back centuries, where they used to put coins on the eyes of the dead, because it was believed that the souls of the dead would have to pay a toll to Charon or Charon. I'm not really sure how you properly pronounce this deity's name, but Charon or Charon is a figure from Greek mythology who is supposed to be Hades' ferryman, who would take the souls of the dead across the river Styx into Hades. Dante Alighieri would later make Charon a character in the Inferno. So that's another fun interpretation you could have, is that Ryder is actually Hell's ferryman. And again, I want to reiterate that the film is not literally a ghost movie. Like, the film doesn't outright say that John Ryder is some kind of spirit in physical form, but there's sort of this subtle undercurrent of the otherworldly. Again, you could interpret it as he's just a psychopath who just happens to be everywhere Jim is. But there's something unnatural about John Ryder that the film never really puts its finger on. And another way you could look at it is perhaps Ryder is a regular human, but perhaps fate or destiny did bring these two men together. Now, I also gotta mention the cinematography from John Seeley, I think is the cinematographer's name. It's absolutely masterful. Like, this is a beautifully shot film. Now, John Seeley, I believe, is from Australia, and even though this is an American film, it does have kind of an Ozploitation element to it. Especially a lot of the car chases in the film, and a lot of the action in the film has a real Road Warrior quality to it, even though I know John Seeley had nothing to do with that. Actually, and speaking of that, John Seeley would go on to do the cinematography for Mad Max Fury Road. But again, the film, even though this is an American film, it's shot with kind of an Australian sensibility. And then the music in the film by Mark Isham, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, but again, masterful. A brilliant score. Now, I gotta give a few words on this Blu-ray set that I have The Hitcher on. It is an amazing, amazing box set, especially if you are a collector of physical media. It comes with the original script by Eric Red, as well as a book containing interviews with Eric Red and Robert Harmon, as well as critical essays on the film. The Blu-ray comes with a shit-fuck ton of special features, including several documentaries on the film, 2 audio commentaries, the short film China Beach, as well as a short film called Telephone, written and directed by Eric Red. The Blu-ray also comes with an episode of one of my favorite movie podcasts, The Projection Booth, on this film. The Projection Booth is a podcast I've been listening to for years. I've actually interacted with Mike White, the main host of that podcast, a little bit online. He actually used to comment on some of my Facebook statuses. Years ago, I did a list of what I thought were some of the best politically charged horror films, and he actually commented on that list and complimented me on it. So it's kind of cool seeing an episode of this guy's show included as a bonus feature on this Blu-ray set, but it's an incredible podcast if you ever get a chance to check it out. But yeah, The Hitcher is a classic. It's one of my favorite horror films, it's one of my favorite action movies, it's one of my favorite psychological thrillers. Whichever category you want to put it in, it is one of my favorite films, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Now, as I pointed out before, this had a sequel in 2003 and a remake in 2007. I'm going to be reviewing both of those, but frankly, it didn't need either. And you can see this film's influence on later films like Joyride and the Russell Crowe film Unhinged. And apparently this is one of Christopher Nolan's favorite movies, and honestly, there are some similarities between the John Ryder character and Christopher Nolan's version of the Joker from The Dark Knight. Especially how in that, we don't really know the Joker's backstory. He gives several backstories in the film, all of which contradict each other, and none of which are probably even true. Again, in that movie, we don't really know who the Joker is, or even why he's doing this. Very similar to John Ryder. And granted, I know the Joker was kind of like that in the comics as well, and Christopher Nolan was obviously borrowing from Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, but I definitely think he was borrowing a little from The Hitcher as well. There's also a scene in The Dark Knight when the Joker is in police custody and Jim Gordon says we have no identification on him, none of his fingerprints match anything on our records, and Captain Estridge had a very similar line about John Ryder when Ryder is in police custody at the end of The Hitcher. So yeah, that was my review on The Hitcher, and my next movie review will be on The Hitcher 2, I've Been Waiting. Yeah, not really looking forward to that one.